Jameson Blackwood had it all. A sprawling empire worth billions, a towering penthouse high above the Chicago skyline, and enough luxury to drown in. He was the kind of man whose name appeared in the headlines alongside powerful CEOs, celebrity figures, and influential politicians. At 42, he commanded Blackwood Holdings, a global conglomerate with interests in everything from cutting-edge biomedicine to five-star hospitality chains. His word was law in boardrooms, and his decisions shaped cityscapes. Yet despite this outward success, Jameson felt the weight of something far more oppressive than the empire he had built: loneliness. For years, Jameson had played the game. He had built a fortress around himself, where every smile, every handshake was manufactured. People didn't approach him as Jameson Blackwood, they approached him as the billionaire. A man who had conquered the world. It was all too predictable. The subtle fawning of executives, the sycophantic nods of employees, the carefully curated friendships. Nothing genuine, nothing real. At times, it felt like he was surrounded by mirrors, each reflecting a carefully constructed version of himself, one that had been crafted to please the world, to meet its expectations, but not to satisfy his own soul. He had long since stopped seeking out authenticity in his interactions. Why bother? The few genuine moments had been buried beneath layers of societal games. Who would ever truly see him as a person and not just a business opportunity? He had built his empire on calculated risks and precise decisions. But for all his wealth, he hadn't built any real connections. One evening, as Jameson leaned back in his plush leather chair, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. Outside, the city lights flickered like a sea of gold below him, yet it was the man in the reflection that captured his attention. Was this who he had become? A figure towering over the world but utterly alone? In that moment, the weight of his success seemed unbearable. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him and not seen a fortune, a CEO, a brand. He had become a man disconnected from his humanity. It was then that he decided something had to change. Jameson had always been used to people treating him with deference. When he walked into a room, heads turned. But he knew that the way people responded to him had more to do with the way he was perceived rather than who he truly was. He had made his fortune by being observant, by studying people's behavior and reading between the lines. It was what made him so successful. But that same observation had led him to one chilling conclusion: the world was full of pretense. That night, sitting at his office desk, an idea began to form. What if he could step out of the glass walls he had built around himself? What if he could experience the world through the eyes of someone ordinary, someone who wasn't impressed by his wealth, power, or name? He set his mind to it. It wasn't enough to just blend in, he had to disappear. The real Jameson Blackwood had been buried beneath layers of suits, luxury cars, and opulent homes. Tonight he would strip all of that away. He would experience what it was like to be someone invisible, someone who was judged for what he did and not for what he owned. The next day, Jameson made his way to the south side of Chicago, a place where no one knew his name. He strolled into a small second-hand store tucked between two rundown buildings. The air was thick with the smell of old leather and vintage clothing, the kind of store where every item had a story to tell. Jameson perused the racks, carefully selecting clothes that were worn and faded. The goal was to look like a man who had seen better days. He found a faded corduroy jacket with worn elbow patches, a plaid shirt that had clearly seen better decades, and a pair of old work boots scuffed from years of use. He even picked up a pair of non-prescription glasses with thick frames, a look that had no intention of being stylish, but instead ordinary. As he dressed, he could almost feel a different persona taking shape. For the first time in years, he wasn't Jameson Blackwood, the billionaire. He was just Jim, a man who might be struggling to make ends meet. There was a strange comfort in it. The anonymity was refreshing, a break from the constant spotlight he had been under for so long. Jameson stood in front of the cracked mirror in the gas station bathroom near the store, inspecting his new look. The reflection staring back at him was unrecognizable. No tailored suit. No polished shoes. Just a regular man in worn-out clothes with a rough edge to him. Jim, the man who didn't have to worry about the pressure of running a billion-dollar empire. He stared at his reflection, wondering what it would be like to live a life where no one knew who you were, where your value wasn't dictated by the money you possessed. The next stop was the Gilded Stir, the flagship restaurant of his hospitality division. He had never set foot inside before, though he had heard nothing but glowing reviews from his COO, Arthur Pendleton. It was one of the most expensive, exclusive places in the city, a high-end steakhouse known for its dry-aged beef, luxury wines, and a clientele that included celebrities, city officials, and billionaires. Jameson had always viewed the Gilded Stir as just another successful investment, a money-making machine. But now, as he walked through its golden doors, he was eager to see the world behind the scenes. He wanted to know how his restaurant operated, and whether the soul of the place was as polished as its exterior. For tonight he wasn't the owner. He was just another man walking in off the street. The hostess at the door gave him a swift, dismissive glance. She raised an eyebrow at his attire, his worn jacket and scuffed boots, before offering him a half-smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice laced with polite skepticism. "A table for one," Jameson said, his voice rougher than usual. He could hear the edge in it, a small concession to the role he was playing. A role that felt strangely liberating. The hostess hesitated, her eyes scanning the crowded room. "Do you have a reservation?" "No," Jameson replied. She gave him a cold smile. "We're typically fully booked. Let me see what I can do." She tapped her tablet, her fingers moving with exaggerated precision as though it was an inconvenience to help him. After a brief moment, she glanced up. "I can seat you at a small table near the kitchen entrance. It's all we have available." "Perfect," Jameson said, suppressing a smile. The choice of table wasn't important. What mattered was that he was no longer the man whose every whim was catered to. Tonight, he was just a man in a crowd trying to find the honesty he had been missing for so long. He had everything. But not the one thing that mattered: trust. Jameson Blackwood stared out over the city from the same panoramic windows of his penthouse that he had looked through 1,000 times. The skyline was bathed in the warm glow of the evening sun, but tonight, even the beauty of Chicago felt distant. He could see the city's vibrancy, the lights, the movement, the endless possibilities, and yet, it all seemed so irrelevant to him now. His empire had grown beyond anything he'd ever dreamed of, but with it, the genuine connections had dwindled, replaced by the soulless interactions of wealth and status. He knew the world he had built, the kingdom of glass and steel that stood below him, wasn't a true world. It was a curated performance, an illusion that he had perfected over the years. Every business deal, every handshake, every investment had been calculated, not based on people or values, but on profit margins and market trends. In the boardrooms, his voice was the loudest. In the luxury penthouses, he was the most celebrated. But behind the walls of his corporate fortress, Jameson was invisible. To the world, he was a titan, an almost mythical figure. To himself, he was a man who had lost the ability to connect. For years, he had told himself that wealth and power could buy everything: respect, admiration, even affection. Yet, as the years passed, he realized it had only bought him silence. The more successful he became, the more he built his empire, the more isolated he became. The vast corridors of his mansion echoed with emptiness, as if the walls themselves recognized that real connections had become foreign to him. Jameson had built his empire from the ground up. From the small office in a crowded building to the sprawling corporate offices and skyscrapers that touched the sky, he had carefully crafted his path. He had surrounded himself with the brightest minds, the wealthiest partners, and the most loyal employees. The walls of Blackwood Holdings were adorned with the finest art, the furniture more luxurious than anything most people would ever dream of owning. But the irony, he realized, was in the way the world saw him. His name was spoken with awe, but it was always accompanied by a silent distance. People didn't see Jameson as a person, they saw a symbol. He was no longer a man, he was an asset, a means to an end. His friends weren't friends, they were alliances. His conversations weren't real, they were carefully planned, rehearsed. The rare moments when someone might genuinely smile at him were always followed by an uncomfortable silence, as if they had just remembered his worth. Jameson had become nothing more than his net worth. Despite the immensity of his wealth, there were few who had seen Jameson for who he really was. He had cultivated a network of people around him, but none of them had ever broken through the walls. There was Arthur Pendleton, his loyal COO. Arthur had been with him since the beginning, weathering every storm, managing every crisis. He was Jameson's closest ally in business, but even Arthur had his place in the machine, his role, his duties. Their conversations were efficient, devoid of any deeper connection. They talked about business, about growth, about profits, but never about their personal lives, never about what really mattered. Jameson had always respected Arthur, but he knew Arthur's admiration came from a place of professionalism, not friendship. And then there was Sophia, his ex-wife. They had been married young, full of dreams, but the weight of his rising empire had eventually torn them apart. Their marriage had been an arranged convenience, a pairing of convenience rather than love. She had been a part of his world, but he had long since let go of her. Now they shared custody of their teenage son, and the exchanges were cordial, sometimes even pleasant but never intimate. She was another part of his life that was no longer real. The more people Jameson surrounded himself with, the more he realized they were all playing their parts. They were just like him, trapped in a world where true human connection had no place. Jameson's success had come at a steep price, one that was only becoming clearer to him now. The deeper he climbed into the world of luxury and power, the more he had to sacrifice to maintain it. He had become the master of the game of wealth. He knew every rule, every strategy, every flaw in the system. He could manipulate markets with a flick of his finger, make billions in a heartbeat. But in the pursuit of those billions, he had lost what was truly important. Friendship had become transactional. Love had become a distant memory. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him and not seen his bank account or his title. There were no more genuine smiles, no more spontaneous moments of kindness. Everything was calculated, everything had a price tag. Even the people closest to him were part of the machine, part of his empire, playing their roles for the benefit of his bottom line. He had created a world that was perfect in every way, except for the one thing that mattered most: connection. And so, as Jameson sat there in his penthouse that evening, looking at the sprawling city lights below, he made a decision. He couldn't live like this anymore. He couldn't continue building his empire on this hollow foundation. He had to test the world outside his fortress. He had to feel what it was like to be invisible, to be unimportant, to live in a world where his worth was measured not by his wealth, but by who he was as a person. With a sense of determination, Jameson started planning. He would shed the skin of Jameson Blackwood, the CEO, and become Jim, a man just trying to survive in the world. The clothes he wore would no longer define him. He would enter a world where his fortune meant nothing, and where every interaction was grounded in the reality of human connections. The next day he would go undercover. He would visit the Gilded Stir, a restaurant he owned, but this time not as the man who ran it. This time he would be a stranger, a man in the crowd. The restaurant was everything Jameson had built, but tonight, it felt like the antithesis of everything he stood for. The Gilded Stir was the jewel in Jameson Blackwood's crown, a restaurant so exclusive it was the pride of his entire hospitality empire. For years, it had been a destination for the city's elite, the wealthy businessmen, the politicians, the celebrities. The food was renowned, the service impeccable, and the atmosphere luxurious. It was the epitome of fine dining, and Jameson had meticulously crafted every detail to be perfect. But tonight, the restaurant felt like a world entirely separate from his own. It was a spectacle, a curated environment where every detail, the lighting, the music, the decor, had been engineered to project a specific image. An image of opulence, sophistication, and untouchable luxury. It was a place where status was the main course, and the only thing more valuable than the expensive wines was the power wielded by its patrons. Jameson walked through the heavy brass doors of the restaurant, the soft clinking of silverware and the hum of murmured conversation enveloping him. But for the first time he didn't feel the warmth of the place. He felt an odd, cold distance, like a spectator in a show he'd never truly understood. As he stepped into the dimly lit dining room, the host, a tall, perfectly groomed woman, glanced at his shabby attire with the briefest flicker of disdain before quickly masking it with a smile. "A table for one?" she asked, her voice polite but dismissive. Her gaze flicked to his worn jacket and the scuffed boots on his feet, a stark contrast to the sharp suits and polished shoes of the other patrons. Jameson could feel her judgment, though it was expertly hidden behind her practiced smile. "That's right," he replied, his voice not as commanding as it usually was. There was no confidence in it tonight, only the raw honesty of a man seeking something he couldn't name. She hesitated for a moment, no doubt weighing whether or not this man was worthy of a table in her precious restaurant. Finally, after tapping away at her tablet with exaggerated precision, she sighed. "Let me check if we have any availability." She returned a moment later, her smile as strained as ever. "I can seat you at a small table near the kitchen entrance. It's all we have available." Jameson nodded without a word. This was exactly what he wanted. He was not here to dine in luxury. He was here to observe, to experience what it was like to be invisible, to be seen not for what he owned but for who he was. The table the hostess directed him to was tucked away in a dim corner of the room, near the swinging kitchen doors. From this spot, Jameson could see everything: the waitstaff rushing back and forth, the busboys carefully clearing empty plates, the chefs plating dishes with precision and flair. It was the machinery of the restaurant, an unrelenting operation that was constantly in motion, but somehow, it all felt artificial. The polished smiles, the seamless choreography of service, the almost sterile precision in everything, nothing felt real. He took a deep breath, observing the dance of the staff around him. The restaurant hummed with the energy of the city's wealthiest, but Jameson felt none of the usual exhilaration that came with his position. Instead, he felt a sense of disconnection, as if he was a ghost watching from the outside. He scanned the room, watching the dinner parties and business deals unfold at nearby tables. Here was a conversation about a merger. There, a group of high-profile politicians laughed at a joke from a well-dressed investor. The air was thick with calculated charm, with performance, and yet it felt so empty. These were people who had everything money could buy, but nothing of value beyond their superficial interactions. In the midst of all this wealth and power, Jameson couldn't help but feel a crushing sense of loneliness. The world he had created, one that looked so perfect on the surface, felt hollow. It was a mirror of his own life, one that reflected back a carefully constructed version of success, but not the truth. No one here was real. As Jameson sat back in his chair, nursing a glass of water, he noticed her. She was different from the others. While the rest of the staff moved with practiced precision, like robots in an elegant dance, this waitress seemed to carry something else in her eyes, a hint of tiredness, a subtle nervousness that was hard to ignore. There was an air of vulnerability about her, something raw and human, far removed from the polished professionalism of the rest of the staff. Her name tag read Rosemary, and as she approached his table with a small basket of bread, her hand trembled slightly. It was an almost imperceptible gesture, but to someone used to reading people, it spoke volumes. Her smile was forced, but there was something about the way she looked at him, something that made him feel like she saw him, not as a billionaire but as just another person, just a man. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice soft and clear, though there was a slight edge to it, exhaustion behind the politeness. Jameson studied her for a moment, wondering who she was, what had brought her to this place. What was her story? What had made her different from the others who smiled with practiced ease? She wasn't like the polished staff who served him with mechanical precision. Rosemary seemed like someone who was just trying to survive, not to impress. He glanced down at the worn black non-slip shoes she wore, heels that had been worn down from hours of standing, cracked leather near the toes. They were the shoes of someone who worked hard, but who couldn't afford to buy a new pair. He noted the faint dark circles under her eyes, a sign of someone who didn't sleep enough, didn't have the luxury of rest. And in that moment, something in Jameson shifted. Jameson had been observing the staff for hours, noting the subtle ways they interacted with the guests. He had always been fascinated by the unspoken rules of the service industry, the way people treated those in power differently than those they deemed inferior. He had always been the one in charge, the one who received the special treatment, the one who expected to be catered to. But tonight he wasn't that man. Tonight he was just Jim. Rosemary came back to take his order, and as she spoke, Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't like the others. She wasn't polished or calculated. She was real, even in her exhaustion. When he ordered the cheapest beer on the menu, he watched her closely, waiting for any hint of judgment. But there was none. Her response was steady, professional, almost warm. She didn't look at him like he was out of place. She didn't try to suggest a more expensive option. She simply nodded, smiled, and said, "Of course. I'll be right back with that." She was just another face in the crowd, yet something about her made him feel like he was seeing her for the first time. As Jameson sat quietly at his table, watching the delicate dance of the restaurant, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't the kind of attention he was used to, the kind that came with his name, with his wealth, but something more subtle. Something that felt almost like a connection. He had spent the last few hours observing the rest of the staff, each one moving like clockwork, offering fake smiles and perfunctory greetings to the patrons who passed through the restaurant's opulent doors. Every action was calculated, measured to perfection, just as he had built his own world. Yet none of it felt real. But then there was Rosemary. There was a difference in the way she approached him compared to the other staff. Rosemary wasn't like the others. She wasn't polished, like the perfectly manicured hostess who had given him a disdainful look upon his arrival, or the well-dressed waiters who barely made eye contact. Rosemary was different. She had a genuineness about her, something he hadn't encountered in years, not even from the people who were closest to him. Her expression wasn't just polite, it was sincere. Her smile, though tired, didn't feel rehearsed. It wasn't one of those practiced expressions he had seen countless times before, the ones that were meant to be pleasing, not real. She didn't see him as Jameson Blackwood, the billionaire. She saw him simply as someone sitting alone at her table. He watched as she moved about the restaurant with an efficiency that could only come from years of experience. But it wasn't just the way she worked. There was something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. It was the way she seemed to exist in the background, moving through the space unnoticed by most, but somehow her presence felt more real than anyone else's. And in that moment, Jameson realized, he had been observing her without even meaning to. Rosemary's interactions with the guests were flawless, but Jameson could see the strain behind her calm exterior. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she placed a basket of bread on his table. Her fingers were quick, but there was a nervousness in the way she moved, a subtle unease that came through even in her most professional moments. Jameson could read people. He had spent years perfecting the art of human observation, decoding body language, picking up on the slightest shifts in tone and posture. He had learned to spot fear, desperation, and discomfort in the most subtle of gestures. And Rosemary's hands, though steady, betrayed a tiredness he couldn't ignore. As she walked away, he couldn't help but notice the worn shoes she was wearing, the soles nearly flat from endless hours of standing. They were the shoes of someone who had been on her feet for too long, someone who had no luxury to spare. In a place like this, where wealth and status were so visibly flaunted, it struck him how out of place those shoes were. They were a reminder that not everyone in this room lived in the world of golden opportunity and endless excess. For the first time that night, Jameson found himself wondering who she was beneath the surface. What was it that brought her here? What kept her working long hours in a place like this, serving food to people who would never see her for anything other than the waitress? As the evening wore on, Jameson's curiosity about her only deepened. He could sense there was more to her than met the eye. Most of the time he would have dismissed it. He would have assumed it was just another passing interaction with someone unimportant. But tonight, in this strange undercover experiment of his, he wasn't just looking for authenticity in others, he was searching for it in himself. When Rosemary returned to his table to take his order, he watched her more closely. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held a depth he hadn't expected. They weren't the eyes of someone who simply wanted to get through the night. They were the eyes of someone who had seen something in the world that had made them stronger, someone who had been through something difficult but had not yet given up. She asked if he had made his decision on what to order. Jameson had already decided on the cheapest beer, knowing this was part of his test, his experiment to see how the staff treated someone who wasn't a big spender. He was curious to see if her face would betray the judgment he had become so used to over the years. But there was no judgment in her eyes. Instead, there was something almost comforting in the way she responded, something that made him feel like he wasn't just another nameless customer. She didn't ask him to order a more expensive drink or a higher-priced dish. She treated him as if he mattered, not because of what he could spend, but because he was simply another human being sitting at her table. Jameson could feel the walls around him begin to crack. In that fleeting exchange, something shifted. It wasn't the beer, nor the bread basket, nor the food she served him. It was the genuine respect she showed him in a room full of people who were quick to judge based on appearances. Rosemary wasn't playing the game that everyone else was. She wasn't seeing him for his name or his wealth, she was seeing him for what he truly was in that moment. A man sitting alone in a restaurant, just another face in the crowd. And for the first time in a long time, Jameson felt a sliver of humanity. He had walked into this restaurant expecting to be invisible, just another man in a sea of faces. But he had been seen. For once, someone had looked past his carefully crafted persona and simply seen him. The longer Jameson watched, the more he realized that Rosemary was playing a game with stakes far higher than he had imagined. The night was well into its rhythm when Jameson began to notice something he hadn't before. It wasn't the food, the wine, or the delicate hum of conversation filling the space. No, it was the tension, a palpable, invisible force that seemed to radiate from Rosemary with each step she took, each tray she balanced. At first, he had attributed it to the typical pressure of working in such an upscale, fast-paced environment. He had seen waitstaff, especially those in high-end restaurants, carry an air of controlled stress. But this was different. This wasn't just the weight of the job, it was something deeper, more dangerous. It was the kind of tension that Jameson had seen only in people who were hiding something. A secret, a lie, or a burden they couldn't share. For a moment he wondered if he was reading too much into it. But the longer he observed, the clearer it became. Rosemary was playing a game, but the stakes were far higher than he had first imagined. She wasn't just balancing plates or serving drinks, she was balancing fear, duty, and something even more sinister that lurked beneath the surface. Jameson leaned back in his chair, pretending to be absorbed in his meal, but his eyes never left her. She moved with practiced efficiency, but there was a tension in the way she held herself. Her posture was too stiff, her movements too deliberate. It wasn't the easy grace he had seen in some other staff members. This was the rigidness of someone who was constantly looking over their shoulder. As she approached his table again, Jameson caught sight of something that made his gut tighten, a faint tremor in her hand as she set down his water glass. It was the smallest of gestures, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but Jameson had learned to spot these signs. His eyes followed her as she walked away, the tension still etched into every step. But this time he noticed something else. The way her eyes flicked quickly to the manager, Gregory Finch, who was watching her from across the room. Jameson hadn't paid much attention to Gregory Finch at first. The manager had been smooth in his interactions, charming in the way he carried himself and polite to the patrons. But now, with the benefit of distance and time, Jameson realized there was something about him that didn't sit right. Finch had been circling the room all evening, keeping an eye on the guests but also on his staff. His smile never quite reached his eyes, and his polite gestures had a way of lingering a little too long. It was as if he was always looking for something, as if he were waiting for an opportunity to strike. Jameson watched him now, noting the way Finch's gaze locked onto Rosemary every time she passed by. The subtle control he exerted over her was palpable. The way his eyes narrowed when he saw her interact with him, the way he lingered just a little too long when she delivered food or refilled drinks, it was the kind of behavior Jameson had seen before in abusive environments, where someone used their position to manipulate and intimidate others. Jameson had dealt with men like Finch before, men who played games of power behind closed doors, hiding their true intentions behind a veil of civility. But something told him that this wasn't just about a power trip. This was more personal, more dangerous. And Rosemary was caught right in the middle of it. As the evening wore on, the tension between Rosemary and Finch became more obvious. Jameson watched the way Finch's eyes followed Rosemary's every move, the way she flinched slightly every time he addressed her. Her movements became more careful, more controlled, as if she were trying to anticipate his next move. It was clear to Jameson that something was wrong. At one point, he saw Rosemary lean in to speak with Finch, her voice barely above a whisper. Whatever she said made Finch's smile falter for a moment, before he straightened and gave her a dismissive nod. The brief exchange, though quiet and swift, left Jameson with a feeling of unease. There was something that Rosemary was afraid to say, something that made her avoid meeting his gaze directly. And Finch, he knew how to exploit that fear. Jameson's gut tightened. Something wasn't right. Jameson had always been able to read the subtleties of people's actions. He had built his empire on that very skill, understanding how to read body language, how to catch the nuances in people's voices and movements that revealed their true intentions. And right now, everything about Rosemary's behavior was screaming at him. She was trapped, playing a game where the rules were stacked against her, and the stakes were life-changing. As he sipped his water, his thoughts raced. He had entered this restaurant as a simple test, a way to experience life outside of the suffocating world of his wealth. But now he was witnessing something far more important. This wasn't just a test of authenticity, it was a test of character. He couldn't just walk away from this. Rosemary was more than just a waitress. She was a person in danger, a victim of a system much larger than herself. And if he was going to get to the truth, he needed to see things from her perspective. He needed to understand the game she was playing, the one where the odds were stacked against her, where every move could be her last. Jameson's eyes followed Rosemary again as she moved through the restaurant. This time, however, his gaze wasn't just observant, it was calculating. He noticed the way she was dodging Finch's gaze, how she seemed to move with purpose but also with a sense of nervousness, as though every step she took had a hidden cost. She was trying to stay under the radar, trying to do her job without attracting too much attention from the manager. But Jameson knew something more now. This wasn't just about a disgruntled employee or a nervous waitress. There was something deeper at play, something that had nothing to do with running food or taking orders. There was a secret, one that Rosemary was trying desperately to keep hidden, a secret she didn't dare speak aloud. And in that moment, as their eyes met for a brief second, when she seemed to sense his silent scrutiny, Jameson realized that the note, the one she had slipped to him earlier, wasn't just a message. It was a warning. One simple gesture, one piece of paper, and everything Jameson thought he knew about this place was turned upside down. As the night wore on, Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that something was building beneath the surface, something that he hadn't quite understood. The hum of conversation around him, the clinking of silverware and crystal glasses, all seemed to blur together in a cacophony of noise. But underneath that noise there was something else, a feeling, a sense of impending revelation. It was as though everything in this place was carefully crafted, But that one small, seemingly insignificant thing could unravel it all. He had been watching Rosemary all evening. Her every move, her subtle gestures, the way she hesitated when she spoke to the other staff members, the way she flinched when Finch addressed her, each action told a story. A story of fear, of something she was hiding. He wasn't sure what it was, but he felt it. The tension in the air, the strain in her eyes. She was desperately trying to hold it all together. Jameson wasn't the only one watching her, though. Finch, too, had been keeping a close eye on her throughout the evening. Jameson could see the way his gaze lingered on her every time she passed by his table. It wasn't just the authority of a manager over an employee, it was something darker, more possessive. It was then that Jameson saw it. Rosemary had just passed by his table, her eyes flicking briefly to his, before moving on to clear a nearby table. As she walked away, she paused for a brief moment, just a second, and then, almost imperceptibly, she slipped something from her hand into the folds of her apron. A note. The movement was so subtle that it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Jameson had been observing her all night. He knew the look in her eyes. The look of someone who had just made a choice. Someone who had taken a risk. His heart raced. He didn't hesitate. As soon as Rosemary moved to the back of the restaurant, Jameson slipped the note from the edge of his table where it had been carefully placed. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the brief message scrawled in hurried handwriting. "You're not the only one watching. Don't trust him." The words were simple, but they hit Jameson with the force of a freight train. His mind raced. What did this mean? Who was watching? What was going on here? And, most importantly, why had she trusted him with this message? Jameson's grip on the note tightened as he read it again, then again. He was no stranger to secrets, to hidden motives, to the games people played in the world of high-stakes business. But this felt different. This was more than just corporate espionage or a backroom deal. It felt personal. And now Rosemary had become part of it. Part of a web of deceit he hadn't yet fully understood. The words, "Don't trust him," were like a challenge, a warning, but also a plea. Who was Rosemary afraid of? Why had she written this note, and what did it mean for her? What was she caught up in? What was the risk to her, and why had she chosen to trust him, a stranger? The questions swirled in his mind like a storm he couldn't control. He had come to this restaurant looking for a taste of authenticity, hoping to experience life without the weight of his fortune, without the expectation of being seen as a billionaire. But now the stakes had escalated. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. This was about a system, a power struggle, and a woman who had risked everything to get his attention. Jameson's eyes scanned the room, his senses heightened. Everything around him felt different now. The polished staff, the expensive decor, the carefully orchestrated dance of wealth and exclusivity, it all seemed like a facade. Rosemary's note had cracked the surface of this well-oiled machine, exposing something darker underneath. He looked across the room at Finch, the manager. The way he had watched Rosemary. The way he had positioned himself at the center of everything. Finch was more than just a manager. He was a puppet master pulling invisible strings, controlling the flow of the restaurant's operations, and likely much more than that. Jameson felt the nervous energy in the air intensify as Finch made his way toward the bar, chatting with a patron. He was all charm, all polished surface. But now, after reading Rosemary's note, Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that there was something far more sinister at play. What if Finch wasn't just a manager of the restaurant? What if he was part of something much darker, something Rosemary was entangled in? What if this wasn't just a battle for power over the restaurant, but a deeper, more dangerous game? For the first time since entering the restaurant, Jameson felt an unsettling awareness of how small the world he had built really was. There were connections here, connections he couldn't yet see. But one thing was clear. Rosemary had become part of something much bigger than herself. She had sent him a message, a lifeline in the form of a simple note, and now, whether he liked it or not, he was involved. He had walked into this restaurant as an observer, a man seeking truth beyond the mask of wealth. But now, after reading that note, he was no longer an outsider looking in. He was part of the story of a woman risking everything to expose a truth. And whatever that truth was, it was much larger than anything Jameson could have imagined. Jameson stared at the note for a long moment, considering his options. He could walk away, pretend he had never seen the message, never read the words. He could keep his anonymity intact, go back to the world of his empire and luxury, where he knew the rules and could avoid getting entangled in something he didn't fully understand. But that wasn't who he was anymore. This was the moment that had to define him. It had to be different. He had to step forward, to do something, not just sit back and watch from the sidelines. He wasn't just observing anymore. This wasn't about an experiment. This was about action, about standing up for someone who had been left behind, someone who had trusted him with a piece of her soul. Jameson folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket, his mind already racing with possibilities. He couldn't walk away now. He would find out what this message meant. He would uncover the truth. And whatever it took, he was going to make it right. Jameson had been looking for truth all night, but nothing could prepare him for the darkness he was about to uncover. As the minutes passed, the once lively atmosphere of the Gilded Stir began to shift. The usual hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the steady rhythm of the staff felt distant to Jameson now. Every noise, every motion around him seemed muffled, as if the world was slowly fading away. He was no longer simply Jim, the undercover man trying to experience life as an ordinary person. The note he had read, the silent plea from Rosemary, had thrust him into something deeper, something darker. He could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest. Rosemary had made a desperate choice to confide in him. She had seen something in him, a man who, for just a few hours, wasn't part of the elite, but simply another human being. She had trusted him, but what exactly had she gotten him into? Jameson glanced back over at Finch, the manager, who was still circling the room like a predator, observing his staff, his guests. But there was something different in Jameson's perception now. Finch wasn't just the charming, suave manager he had first appeared to be. He wasn't merely the leader of this well-oiled machine of luxury and excess. Jameson's gut told him that Finch was hiding something, something that had remained well concealed beneath the restaurant's sparkling surface. As he watched Finch interact with the guests, something caught his attention. A subtle exchange between Finch and another man, a guest who had arrived just moments earlier. The man was wearing a tailored suit, his posture rigid, his gaze sharp. He looked like someone who belonged in a world that Jameson knew too well. But it wasn't the man himself that grabbed Jameson's attention. It was the way Finch spoke to him. There was an odd familiarity between them, but it wasn't friendly, it was almost conspiratorial. Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that these two men were more than just a manager and a guest. As he watched from his seat, he noticed Finch's body language shift. It wasn't the usual courteous professionalism he'd seen from him all night. This was different. Finch was leaning in close, speaking in a low, intimate tone, the kind of tone that suggested a shared secret. The guest nodded, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Then, in a move that sent a chill down Jameson's spine, Finch placed something into the man's hand. A small envelope, unmarked and plain, but the action was unmistakable. The guest quickly tucked the envelope into his jacket pocket, and the two exchanged a final look. A look that spoke of a silent understanding, a bond that Jameson couldn't ignore. There was no mistaking it now. Something was happening in this restaurant, something far more insidious than he had initially imagined. It wasn't just the usual power plays or shady business deals, it was something darker. Something illegal. Jameson had seen corruption before. It was part of the world he lived in, part of the high-stakes game he played every day. But this was different. This wasn't about making deals or bending the rules. This was about something more personal, more dangerous. As the guest disappeared into the crowd, Finch's eyes once again flicked toward Rosemary, who was now moving swiftly between tables, her face tense and focused. He could see the fear in her eyes, the way she glanced nervously in Finch's direction whenever she thought no one was watching. It was clear that whatever had just transpired between Finch and the guest was tied to Rosemary. She was somehow caught in the middle of something far bigger than just her job as a waitress. Jameson felt the pieces clicking into place. The note, the tension, the hidden exchanges between Finch and the guest. It was all part of a larger puzzle. A puzzle he needed to solve if he was going to understand what Rosemary was really involved in. He couldn't let it go. He had to know what was going on. Without thinking, Jameson stood up from his table. The moment was too crucial to ignore. He couldn't just sit back anymore, observing from the sidelines. This wasn't about blending in anymore. This was about getting to the heart of the matter. He had already seen enough to know that the truth was hidden in plain sight, disguised by luxury, wealth, and the perfect facade of the Gilded Stir. But now the veil had lifted. Rosemary's note had opened his eyes to a world of deception he hadn't been prepared for, and now he was determined to uncover it. He walked toward the bar, keeping his movements casual, pretending to be just another guest enjoying a quiet evening. But his eyes never left Finch. The manager was still circling the room, interacting with patrons, but his posture was slightly more rigid now, more watchful, as if he sensed someone was onto him. Jameson's pulse quickened. He had to make a choice. He could walk away, leave the restaurant, forget the note, forget Rosemary, and return to his comfortable life, untouched by the chaos that was clearly brewing in the undercurrents of the restaurant. But he knew he couldn't do that. He couldn't ignore the call for help he had received through that simple note. Jameson approached the bar, leaning casually against it, trying to blend into the background. He ordered a whiskey, though it felt almost absurd. What was a drink in this moment compared to the revelations he had just uncovered? His mind was racing with questions. What was in that envelope? What kind of operation was Finch running? And why had Rosemary been drawn into this mess? He had to find out. As the bartender turned to prepare his drink, Jameson's eyes scanned the room one more time. He caught a glimpse of Finch, now engaged in a hushed conversation with the guest. Their words were too quiet to hear, but the intensity of their exchange was undeniable. They were talking about something dangerous, and the stakes were much higher than a few illegal trades or shady deals. This wasn't just about money. It was about control, power, and the lengths people would go to maintain it. The bartender handed Jameson his drink, and he took a slow sip, feeling the burn of the alcohol hit the back of his throat. But the sensation was secondary. What mattered was that he had just witnessed something that could change everything. The only question now was, what was he going to do with this information? He had crossed a line. There was no turning back. As he turned to leave the bar, he spotted Rosemary once more, moving through the crowd with purpose. She was still trying to keep her head down, trying to blend in with the other waitstaff. But there was something different in the way she held herself now. It was as if she knew Jameson had seen too much, as if she knew she had pulled him into her world. Jameson watched her for a moment, a decision forming in his mind. He would find out what was really going on here. He couldn't walk away, not now. Not when he was already a part of this. Jameson realized that the shadow looming over Rosemary was darker than anything he had anticipated. Jameson's mind raced as he watched Rosemary move through the crowd, carrying herself with a kind of quiet determination. There was a storm brewing, and it wasn't just about the restaurant or the money. This was something deeper, something far more dangerous than he had initially thought. It wasn't just about the corrupt dealings he had uncovered, it was about the power structures that controlled them, and the invisible forces that would do anything to maintain them. As he took another sip of his whiskey, Jameson's gaze flicked back to Finch, who was now standing near the far corner of the room, speaking to another man. The way he spoke, low, urgent, like a whispered secret, made Jameson feel as though he were watching a scene from a crime syndicate. There was no doubt in his mind anymore. Finch wasn't just a manager, he was the puppet master, pulling strings from the shadows, manipulating everyone around him for his own gain. And Rosemary, unknowingly, had become one of the key players in his dangerous game. Jameson had learned to read people, to understand their motivations. He could tell when someone was hiding something, when they were using power to manipulate others. Finch's power wasn't just in his position, it was in the way he controlled those beneath him, the way he watched them, waited for them to make a mistake. It wasn't an outward display of strength, it was subtle, quiet, and often unseen. But now that Jameson was aware of it, he couldn't unsee it. The way Finch had looked at Rosemary, the way he had almost marked her with his gaze, as if she were a pawn to be moved around at his will. The note Rosemary had passed to him, a desperate warning, had cracked the surface, revealing a world of deceit that ran far deeper than the restaurant's polished exterior. Jameson could feel it now, in the tension of every interaction, in the way the staff moved just a little bit more nervously whenever Finch was near. Jameson had made a choice. He couldn't turn back now. Not after seeing what he had seen. But the deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. Finch wasn't just involved in some underhanded business dealings, he was the head of a system, one that stretched far beyond the restaurant's walls. A system that fed on fear, on control, and on silence. As Jameson observed Finch and the guest from earlier, he couldn't help but think about Rosemary again. What was her connection to all of this? Why had she gotten involved? She had seemed so innocent, so genuine in her efforts to keep things professional, to simply do her job. But there was a price to that professionalism, a price that had been forced upon her, one she could never afford to ignore. Jameson replayed the moments he had shared with her. Her nervous glances, the subtle signs of stress in her movements, the way she flinched when Finch's eyes locked onto hers. She was afraid, but she was also strong. Despite the pressure, despite the fear, she had passed him the note. She had trusted him with the truth. Jameson's mind flashed back to the note. The simple words, "Don't trust him," now carried a weight he hadn't fully understood at the time. The him in question wasn't just Finch, it was everything he represented. He was part of a larger system, one built on manipulation and intimidation. Rosemary had been caught in the middle, trying to survive in a world where the stakes were life and death. It wasn't just the restaurant. It wasn't just about the money. It was about power, and Finch was the embodiment of that power. Jameson knew that if he was going to get to the heart of what was happening here, he needed to understand the full scope of Finch's network. It wasn't just about one corrupt manager. Finch was a cog in a much larger machine. The guest he had seen earlier, the one who had exchanged the envelope with Finch, was the key. He wasn't just a wealthy diner, he was connected. Jameson had learned enough in his years of dealing with high-stakes business to recognize the signs of organized crime, the way players operated in the shadows, pulling strings without anyone noticing. The envelope Finch had handed off was the key, and Jameson knew that uncovering its contents would lead him to the heart of the operation. But he couldn't do it alone. Rosemary had already risked everything by giving him the note, but she had kept her distance, too scared to share the truth. He needed to confront her, get her to trust him enough to reveal what she knew. She had to be the one to break this wide open. But it wasn't going to be easy. Rosemary was trapped in a web of fear, and Jameson understood that. To get to the truth, he would have to gain her trust completely. But first, he needed to make sure that Finch didn't see him as a threat. He couldn't let him know he was on to him. As the evening dragged on, Jameson felt the weight of his decision more and more. He couldn't leave. Not now. Not when everything was so close. Every step he had taken in the restaurant had brought him closer to a truth that was more terrifying than anything he had anticipated. The world of high society, the world of luxury and wealth, had hidden beneath it a dark underbelly, one that could swallow people whole if they weren't careful. As Rosemary moved between tables again, her face tense, her eyes darting toward Finch, Jameson knew that he was right in the middle of something that had far-reaching consequences. He had to act quickly. With a final glance toward Finch, who was busy speaking with another guest, Jameson stood up from his seat, his decision made. He would confront Rosemary, not as a billionaire, not as a man who owned this place, but as someone who was willing to stand beside her in the face of a danger he could barely comprehend. Jameson walked toward the back of the restaurant, his steps firm. This wasn't just about uncovering secrets anymore. This was about stopping something much bigger. And in the process, maybe he would finally understand what it meant to be truly seen, not as a man of wealth but as a man of character. The moment Jameson had been dreading arrived, no longer a spectator, but a participant in a game much darker than he had imagined. Jameson felt a strange sense of urgency as he moved toward the back of the restaurant, his steps quickening with each passing moment. His mind was racing. There was no turning back now. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but they were coming together. Rosemary's note had been the catalyst, and now he could see the intricate web of lies and power struggles that had ensnared her. He had to act, but he had to be careful. Finch had no idea who Jameson truly was, and that was a powerful advantage. As Jameson neared the staff corridor, he caught sight of Rosemary in the distance, her back slightly hunched as she walked between the kitchen and dining area. Her movements were quick, but there was something hesitant about her, like she was trying to avoid being noticed, trying to disappear into the shadows. His pulse quickened. This was the moment. Everything he had observed, the way she had looked at him when she passed him the note, the fear in her eyes every time she glanced at Finch, had led him to this point. She had been too afraid to speak up, too afraid to share the full truth. But now he had to confront her. He had to get her to trust him. The truth depended on it. Jameson reached her just as she was passing through the swinging kitchen doors. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't about confrontation, it was about understanding. It was about breaking through the layers of fear and pressure that had built up around her. "Rosemary," he called softly, stepping in front of her, making sure to keep his voice gentle but firm. "We need to talk." She froze, her body stiffening at the sound of his voice. For a moment, she didn't look at him. She just stood there, frozen in place, as if she were deciding whether to run or face him. The fear was palpable in her stance, and Jameson's heart sank as he realized just how deep her fear went. She wasn't just afraid of Finch. She was afraid of everything, the web she was caught in, the danger she was facing, and the consequences of speaking out. She began, her voice trembling slightly, but she stopped herself. "I don't think you understand." "No," Jameson interjected, his tone still calm but now laced with urgency. "I think I do understand. You've been trying to warn me, trying to get me to see what's going on here." He took a step closer, lowering his voice even further. "What I need to know is what's really happening. What is Finch involved in? What is he doing to you?" Rosemary's eyes flicked to the kitchen doors, then to the dining room as if expecting someone to come around the corner at any moment. She was trapped, and the anxiety was written all over her face. "Jameson," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You don't know what you're getting into. This is bigger than the restaurant. It's bigger than anything you can imagine. Jameson could see that she was about to shut down, about to retreat into silence. He couldn't let that happen. He had to get through to her. He had to make her believe that he wasn't just another person looking to get ahead, someone who would abandon her the moment things got tough. He had to show her that, despite his wealth, despite the empire he had built, he could be trusted. "Rosemary, you don't have to be afraid of me," he said, his voice softening. "I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to help." She hesitated for a long moment, and just when Jameson thought she might pull away again, she finally spoke. "There's a network," she said, her voice breaking. "It's not just Finch. He's only the tip of the iceberg. There are others, people who come here, people who make deals in the shadows. They use the restaurant to launder money, move illegal goods. I don't know the full details. I'm just a part of it, trying to stay unnoticed." Jameson's stomach churned as the pieces fell into place. He had suspected something was wrong, but this was far worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just about corrupt managers or bad business practices. This was about criminal operations, and Rosemary had been caught in the middle of it all, forced to play a role in the darkness, a role she had no way of escaping. Jameson's mind raced as he processed her words. The criminal network running under the guise of the Gilded Stir was more than just a money-making operation. It was a dangerous operation, one that had roots far beyond the restaurant's walls. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, if he didn't make a move now, Rosemary's life could be in danger. "Do you know who they are?" he asked, his voice urgent now. "Do you know who's pulling the strings?" Rosemary looked away, her gaze shifting to the back door where Finch had disappeared earlier. "I don't know everything. But Finch, he's the one who controls it all. He's the middleman, the one who connects the people on the inside with those on the outside. And he's dangerous, Jameson. You don't want to mess with him." Jameson felt the weight of her words settle in. Finch wasn't just a manager. He was the linchpin in a far-reaching criminal network, one that extended beyond the restaurant and into the city's underworld. This was no longer just about observing the staff and seeing the reality behind the polished veneer. This was personal, and Jameson was now tangled in something that he couldn't walk away from. "Rosemary," Jameson said, his tone serious. "I'm not going anywhere. But we need to get out of here. We need to make sure Finch doesn't see us as a threat before we move forward." Her eyes widened as she looked at him, disbelief and fear still hanging in the air. "What do you mean, move forward? We can't go to the authorities. Finch owns this place. He has connections everywhere." "I don't care about Finch," Jameson said firmly. "I care about getting you out of this mess, and I will do whatever it takes to make sure you're safe." Jameson made a decision in that moment. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He wasn't just a wealthy man pretending to be ordinary. He was now a part of this, a part of her story. And no matter the cost, he was going to see it through. As the noise of the restaurant continued around them, Jameson felt the weight of the moment. It was no longer about exposing Finch's corruption or unmasking a criminal operation. It was about fighting for something. Fighting for someone who had been pushed to the edge, someone who had no way out. He wasn't just saving Rosemary. He was saving himself too. Jameson had entered the Gilded Stir seeking the truth, but what he found was something far greater. An opportunity for redemption, not just for Rosemary but for himself as well. The night had reached its peak, but Jameson felt no sense of triumph. The revelations of the past few hours had been like a storm crashing down on him. He had never expected to be involved in something like this. A criminal operation hidden in plain sight, run by someone as seemingly harmless as Gregory Finch. But that was the world he had entered, the world of power, manipulation, and greed. And now he was part of it, whether he liked it or not. But there was one thing Jameson had learned that night. He couldn't just walk away anymore. Rosemary had trusted him. She had put her faith in him when she had no reason to, and now, it was his turn to do the same. He wasn't about to let her become just another casualty in a world he had grown to despise. He had seen the cost of his own actions, the way he had built an empire on the backs of people like Rosemary, people who had no voice, no power. Now it was time to change that. Jameson's decision was made. He wasn't just going to sit back and watch Rosemary disappear into the shadows. He couldn't. Not after everything she had risked to warn him. She had been trapped in this web of lies, manipulated by Finch and his associates, and he had the means to help her escape it. He had already seen how dangerous Finch was, how deeply entrenched the criminal operations ran. But there was something else Jameson had seen, something even more dangerous: the indifference. People like Finch didn't care about who they hurt as long as they got what they wanted. But Jameson wasn't like them. He wasn't going to let Finch get away with this. He wasn't going to let Rosemary remain a pawn in a game she never asked to play. "I'll get you out of here," Jameson said quietly as they stood in the back corridor of the restaurant. Rosemary looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, but there was something else in them now, hope. It was a fleeting, fragile thing, but it was there. "How?" she whispered. Her voice was shaky, and Jameson could hear the weight of her exhaustion in every word. She had been through too much to think that anyone could actually help her. Too many people had promised her something, only to let her down when it mattered most. Jameson looked her in the eye. "I don't know yet. But I know one thing. Finch isn't untouchable. I'll use whatever I have to take him down." She shook her head, almost in disbelief. "You don't understand. He's everywhere. He's connected. You can't just go after him." "I know," Jameson replied, his voice firm. "But you're not alone anymore. We're going to make sure he doesn't get away with this." Jameson didn't know exactly how he would take down Finch. But he knew he had to start somewhere. He needed to expose the web of corruption, and he needed to make sure the people who had been trapped in it, like Rosemary, could escape. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this restaurant hours ago, looking for authenticity in a world that had long since lost its meaning. Now he was determined to tear down the very system he had spent his life building. He had the resources, the power, and the connections. But more than that, he had something much more important, a reason to fight. He wasn't doing this for profit or power. He was doing this for justice. Jameson knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who understood the system and how to break it. He reached out to someone he trusted, someone who had been with him throughout his rise to the top. Monica Reeves, a brilliant lawyer he had worked with on several high-profile cases. Monica was smart, no-nonsense, and more importantly, she had a reputation for getting things done. If anyone could help him bring down Finch, it was her. He quickly set up a meeting with Monica, explaining everything he had uncovered, everything he had learned about Finch and the criminal operation that had been running under the restaurant's polished exterior. Monica listened carefully, her expression unreadable as he laid out the facts. "This is going to be a tough fight," she said when he finished. "But I'm in. You're right about one thing, you can't fight this alone. But with the right team we can expose Finch and everything he's been hiding." Together, Jameson and Monica began to plan their next move. It wasn't going to be easy. They would have to move carefully, gather evidence, and build a case that would stand up in court. But Jameson was no stranger to strategy. He knew how to play the game, and this time he wasn't playing for profit or power. He was playing for something more important, redemption. But even as they worked, Jameson couldn't ignore the feeling of danger that lingered over everything. Finch was a powerful man with far-reaching connections. He wasn't going to take kindly to anyone coming after him. Jameson didn't care. He had made his decision. He wasn't going to let Rosemary, or anyone else, fall victim to this system any longer. As Jameson sat in his office later that night, staring out at the city lights below, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, around his empire, around his heart. He had convinced himself that success was the only thing that mattered, that money and power could fix everything. But now he saw the truth. Success didn't mean anything if you couldn't look at yourself in the mirror and know that you had done the right thing. Power didn't mean anything if it was built on the suffering of others. And wealth didn't matter if it kept you from seeing the world as it really was. Now, for the first time in years, Jameson felt like he was on the right path. It wasn't the path he had chosen for himself, but it was the one he needed to be on. It wasn't about building more, it was about tearing down the walls, breaking the chains that had bound people like Rosemary, and giving them the chance to start over. Jameson had stepped into the unknown, but now, in the light of truth, everything was clear. The city skyline gleamed below Jameson's penthouse windows as dawn began to break, casting a soft glow over the horizon. The night had been long, but it had brought him closer to the truth than he had ever expected. In the span of just a few hours, he had witnessed the underbelly of the world he had once ruled, the world of wealth, control, and manipulation. But the journey he had taken wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about finding himself. As he sat there, the weight of everything that had happened settled into his chest. Rosemary's courage had been the spark that ignited everything. She had trusted him even when she had no reason to. And now he had a chance to make things right, not just for her but for himself, for the empire he had built, and for the people he had unintentionally harmed along the way. Over the past few days, Jameson had worked tirelessly with Monica Reeves. They had gathered the evidence they needed, testimonies from former staff members, bank records, and emails that linked Finch to the criminal operation that had been running under the Gilded Stir. But it wasn't just about the evidence. It was about the strategy, the plan to take Finch down without drawing attention to their involvement. Jameson had used his influence to quietly take control of the situation, making sure that the pieces of the puzzle fell into place without raising suspicion. He had contacted local authorities who were known for their discretion, ensuring that everything was handled with care. But he knew the most important part was still ahead, confronting Finch and watching him face the consequences of his actions. The day came sooner than expected. Jameson stood in the boardroom of Blackwood Holdings, waiting for Finch to arrive. His heart was calm, steady, there was no fear left, only resolve. Finch had been playing a dangerous game for too long, and Jameson had no intention of letting him continue. When Finch walked through the door, his usual confident demeanor was replaced with a hint of wariness. He had no idea that his world was about to unravel. The way he looked at Jameson, half recognition, half suspicion, told Jameson everything he needed to know. Finch had suspected someone was onto him, but he had never imagined that it would be Jameson Blackwood himself, standing here ready to expose him. "Mr. Blackwood," Finch said, his voice smooth but tinged with caution. "What's this about? I wasn't expecting a meeting today." Jameson leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral but firm. "I'm afraid you've been too comfortable in your position, Gregory. It's time you learned that no one is untouchable, not even you." Finch stiffened. He was trying to play it cool, but Jameson could see the flicker of panic in his eyes. "I don't know what you mean," Finch replied, his voice becoming more defensive. "I've done everything by the book." "You can't save it," Jameson cut him off. "I've seen the books, the transactions, the illegal activities. I know what you've been doing in the shadows, using the Gilded Stir to launder money, sell illicit goods, and run a criminal network." Finch's face paled. For the first time his cool facade slipped. "You're bluffing. You can't prove any of that." Jameson slid a folder across the table, filled with the evidence they had collected. "I don't need to bluff. You're done, Gregory." Finch's eyes darted to the folder, then back to Jameson. He had no more words. The truth had finally caught up with him. The legal process was swift. With the evidence Jameson and Monica had gathered, Finch was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The criminal network he had built, the lives he had destroyed, and the people he had manipulated all came crashing down. The once powerful manager who had controlled everything from the shadows was now facing the consequences of his actions. As the authorities took him away, Jameson watched from the sidelines, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. This was the moment he had been working toward, the moment when justice had been served. But it wasn't just Finch who had been brought down. It was the entire system of exploitation that had allowed people like Rosemary to remain invisible, trapped in a world they couldn't escape. With Finch gone, the restaurant was no longer the place of fear it had once been. Jameson made sure that Rosemary was the one who was left standing in the end. She had been the catalyst for everything. Her courage had started the chain of events that led to Finch's downfall. He offered her a new position at Blackwood Holdings, one where she could be herself, away from the dark shadows of the Gilded Stir. No longer would she be just a pawn in someone else's game. She was now in control of her own future, and Jameson would ensure that she had the support she needed to succeed. Rosemary, though hesitant at first, took the offer. She had been through so much, but now she was free from the threats, the manipulation, and the fear that had haunted her for so long. She had proven that even in the darkest of times, bravery could spark change. As for Jameson, he stood at the precipice of a new chapter in his life. The man who had once been consumed by power, wealth, and the game of business was no longer the same. He had learned the hard way that true success didn't come from building walls and accumulating riches. It came from the people you help, the lives you change, and the impact you leave behind. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the Gilded Stir weeks ago. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was now someone who understood the value of human connection, of authenticity, of standing up for what's right no matter the cost. The story of Rosemary's triumph was now intertwined with his own, a story of redemption, of second chances, and of finding truth in a world that often hid it behind layers of wealth and power. As Jameson looked out at the city once again, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The empire he had built was still there, but now he had a new sense of purpose. He had made things right. And for the first time in years, he could look at himself in the mirror and know that he had done more than just make money, he had made a difference. The future was wide open now, not just for him, but for the people who had crossed his path. Rosemary had taken the first step toward a new life, and Jameson had taken his own step into a world where power didn't mean control, it meant responsibility.